In 1923, the richest people per capita on Earth lived in Osage County, Oklahoma. Not the richest white people, the richest people anywhere. They had oil under their land. About 2,000 of them held a share of it. In that 1 year, the tribe took in more than $30 million. In today's money, that is over $400 million, and most of them were not allowed to spend it. A full-blood Osage could sit on a fortune in oil and still need a white man's signature to buy a car, to buy a coat, to draw cash for groceries. The government had a word for these Osage. It called them incompetent, not sick, not unable, incompetent as a legal status. And it assigned each of them a guardian, a local white man, to approve every dollar they spent. Into that same system, Congress wrote one more provision. It is a quiet one. If a restricted Osage died, the guardian could ask the court to keep the estate. Hold on to that sentence, because in those same years, the wealthiest people on earth began to die. Not of old age. A woman found in a ravine, her death ruled an accident, until someone looked closer and found a bullet. A man shot in his parked car, a house lifted off its foundation in the middle of the night. And more than those, quieter ones, written down as a wasting illness, as a bad heart, as natural causes, and never opened again. In 1924, the government did look, briefly, at the guardians themselves. The Department of the Interior charged about 24 of them with corruption. Every one of them settled quietly and avoided punishment. Then the system went back to work. The story you may already know ends with an arrest. A federal agent, a powerful rancher named William Hale, a conviction, a prison sentence. Justice, the version says, was done. That is where the famous account stops. It is not where the record stops. The record shows something the arrest never closed. It shows that the killing was not only a crime. On paper, it was a system, a legal machine for moving Osage money into other hands, one signature and one death at a time. And it shows that the men who ran the visible part of that machine were caught, while the machine itself was mostly left standing. This is the account the files keep, not the number the newspapers settled on, the number underneath it. If you follow records that were closed before they were finished, subscribe. One woman sat at the center of it. Her name was Mollie Burkhart. Before it was over, she would bury her mother, her 3 sisters, and a cousin, and be poisoned slowly in her own home. She was also, by law, incompetent to manage the fortune all of them were dying for. Her story begins with the oil. So this one does too. Start with the land, because the land is the whole reason. The Osage did not begin in Oklahoma. Through the 1800s, they were pushed out of Missouri, then out of Kansas, moved along by treaties they did not write. By the 1870s, they were looking for somewhere to land, and they did something almost no other tribe in their position did. They bought their new home. They used their own money to purchase a stretch of rocky hill country in Indian Territory from the Cherokee. At the time, it looked like a poor bargain. The ground was broken and stony. It grew rocks better than corn. Government men considered it close to worthless, which was exactly why the Osage were allowed to have it. It is worth staying a moment on how they came to be there, because it was not a happy accident. The Osage had once ranged across a vast territory in the middle of the continent. Through the 1800s, treaty after treaty stripped it away, pushing them from Missouri into Kansas, and then, when white settlers wanted Kansas too, out of Kansas as well. By the time they reached Indian Territory, they had learned at brutal cost exactly how much an American treaty was worth, once the land beneath it became valuable. So when they took this new reservation, they insisted on buying it outright, with their own money and a deed, precisely so it could not simply be taken back the way everything else had been. That hard lesson, paid for with generations of loss, is the reason the oil rights could later be defended at all. But because they had bought it, they owned it in a way that mattered later. It was not a gift that could be quietly withdrawn. It was property, with a deed. Then, near the turn of the century, men drilling through that useless rock hit oil. The first well of real consequence came in near the end of the 1890s, and within a few years, the trickle became a flood. Prospectors and companies poured across the reservation. Derricks rose over the hills that had been called worthless. The poorest land anyone had been willing to offer, the Osage turned out to sit on one of the richest oil deposits in the country. The cruel joke of their removal had reversed itself completely. The ground chosen for them because no white person wanted it was suddenly the most valuable in America, and the same fact that made it valuable made the people who owned it a problem to be solved. What sat under the Osage Hills turned out to be one of the great oil fields of the age. And now the question was, who owned the part you could not see, the oil below the surface? In most of Indian Territory, the answer was already being arranged in favor of white settlers, through a process called allotment. Allotment took tribal land held in common, cut it into individual parcels, handed one parcel to each tribal member, and declared the leftover acres surplus, open for white settlers to claim. It broke up the shared ground. It was designed to. The Osage could see allotment coming for them too. They could not stop it. So their leaders did the next thing. They fought over the fine print. And in the Osage Allotment Act of 1906, they won a clause that would make all the difference. The surface of the land would be divided, member by member. Each person on the tribal roll received an allotment, roughly 650 acres of ground, to own outright. That part looked like ordinary allotment. The clause underneath was the trick. Everything below the surface, all the oil, all the gas, every mineral in the ground, would not be divided at all. It would stay in the hands of the tribe as a whole, one shared estate, and every member on that roll would hold an equal share of the income it produced. They called each share a headright. Understand what that meant, because the entire story turns on it. You could not buy a headright. You could not sell one. It was not a piece of land you could be cheated out of at a land office. A headright was a share in the oil itself, and it paid its holder a cut of every barrel pumped out of the whole reservation. When the field boomed, every headright boomed at the same time. There were about 2,000 of these shares. One for each Osage counted on the final roll. And after 1906, that roll was closed. No new names. The list of who would share the richest ground in America was fixed, written down, and finite. Remember that. A list of exactly who profits is also, in the wrong hands, a list of exactly who is in the way. For a while, though, it was only wealth. The oil companies could not simply drill. They had to lease the right to drill from the tribe, and they had to win that right at auction. So a few times a year, in the little town of Pawhuska, the auctions were held outdoors, in the shade of a big elm tree on a hill. Oilmen came from across the country and sat in folding chairs. A showman named Colonel Ellsworth Walters worked the crowd as auctioneer, and the bidding climbed to numbers that did not sound real. The tree got a nickname. People called it the $1 million elm, because single leases sold under it for more than $1 million each. The record bid, for one tract of 160 acres, was almost $2 million. That was the price, just to drill. The oil came after. All of that money flowed back to the tribe, and then out to the headrights, share by share. The numbers are worth sitting with. By the middle of the 1920s, a single headright paid thousands of dollars a year. An ordinary Osage family, a husband, a wife, and 3 children, each holding a share, took in more than $65,000 in 1926 alone. A schoolteacher of that time might make $1,300 in a year. So one Osage family could earn, without working, what 50 teachers earned by working. The wealth became visible, and then it became a spectacle. Osage families bought automobiles, sometimes several, and hired white chauffeurs to drive them. They built large houses and sent their children to schools back east. Reporters came to gawk and to sneer. Newspapers ran stories about rich Indians and their extravagance, always with the same edge to them, the suggestion that this money had landed on the wrong people. That edge matters, because it prepared the ground. If the public could be brought to believe the Osage did not deserve their money, then it was a short step to believing the Osage could not be trusted to keep it. And that is the step the government took next. Because there was one more feature of the headright, the feature that turns this from a story about wealth into a story about death. A headright could not be bought or sold, but it could be inherited. When a headright holder died, the share did not go back to the tribe. It passed to that person's legal heirs, whoever they were, even if they were not Osage at all. The money could not be taken, but it could be handed down, and a thing that can be handed down can be waited for. Long before anyone was killed, the money drew people the way a light draws insects. The Osage did not spend their royalties in private. Federal rules routed much of it through local white merchants, bankers, and agents, and those men learned quickly how to take their cut. There was an open secret in the county about what people called the Osage price. A car that cost a white buyer $800 might be sold to an Osage buyer for $1,400. A funeral that should have cost $300 was billed at $1,600. Storekeepers kept 2 sets of numbers in their heads, one for ordinary customers and one for the richest customers in America. Around that everyday skimming grew a whole trade. Men moved to Osage County for no reason except the Osage. They married into families. They befriended the wealthy and steered them into worthless investments. They lent money at brutal rates against future oil checks. Locals had a phrase for it. They called it the Indian business, and they said it without shame, as if separating an Osage from an Osage fortune were an honest line of work. And underneath the skimming ran a current of resentment. To many white Oklahomans, the sight of a native family in a chauffeured car was not success. It was an insult that needed correcting. Newspapers fed the mood with cartoons of the lazy, extravagant Indian who had stumbled into riches he could not handle. That idea, repeated often enough, did a specific kind of work. It built the argument that the Osage needed to be protected from their own money, which is to say, protected out of reach of it. That argument was about to become law. By the early 1920s, the Osage were the wealthiest population in the world, head for head, sitting on shares that paid like nothing else in America, shares that could only change hands through death, held by about 2,000 named people on a closed and public list. Everything that happened next was already sitting inside those facts. Someone only had to read them the wrong way. Someone did. The people who would read those facts the wrong way did not come from nowhere. They were carried in by the boom, along with everyone else. When the oil came in hard, In the years around 1920, it did not arrive quietly. Near the town of Burbank, in 1921, one company brought in wells that produced 600 barrels a day, and some that gave more than 2,000. Money on that scale, coming out of the ground, pulls people the way a wound pulls flies. And they came, by the tens of thousands, from every direction, into a stretch of Oklahoma prairie that had held almost no one a generation before. Overnight, Boomtowns rose out of the grass. The most notorious of them was a place officially named Denoya, which almost no one called that. Everyone called it Whiz-Bang. By the end of 1921, Whiz-Bang had more than 300 businesses and houses, where shortly before, there had been open country. It had oil workers by the thousand, and it had everyone who follows oil workers and their wages: gamblers, bootleggers, con men, prostitutes, killers, a whole floating population of people who had come for the money and did not much care how they got their share of it. These towns were dangerous in a way that is hard to picture now. In Whiz-Bang, gunfire in the streets was common enough that it drew no crowd. Messengers rode through at a gallop rather than stop. It was not considered safe for a woman to be out after dark. This was the era of prohibition, so the liquor was illegal and therefore worse. Men drank a cheap alcohol extract that could leave them paralyzed, sold openly in the back rooms, people called Jake joints. The oil work itself killed men regularly, up on the tall wooden derricks, in machinery that showed no mercy. A young man named Clark Gable, before he was anyone, worked the rigs in that country, and said later that he had never in his life been so afraid, and he said it after living through a world war. Hold that world next to the story already building. Into a county of about 2,000, suddenly, spectacularly wealthy Osage came a flood of outsiders who owed the Osage nothing, who often despised them, and who lived at the edge of the law as a matter of course. Violence was ordinary. Strangers arrived and vanished by the week. Bodies turned up in oil towns for 100 sordid reasons, and no one looked hard at most of them. For anyone who wished to make an Osage disappear, this was close to a perfect environment. A murder could hide inside the general lawlessness like a single drop in a flood. A dead body in Osage County in 1923 did not automatically raise an alarm. It could be a bar fight, a bootlegger's quarrel, a robbery, a drunk who fell in a creek. The boom had made the whole county noisy and violent and full of strangers, and that noise was cover. And underneath the chaos ran the other current, the one from the last chapter, the permanent white population of the county, the merchants and bankers and lawyers and ranchers who stayed after each boomtown blew away, had settled into a comfortable arrangement. The Osage had the money. Everyone else had ways of getting it. The lawless newcomers supplied a ready pool of men who would do anything for cash. The respectable locals supplied the positions that mattered: the sheriff's office, the courts, the guardianships, the doctors, the undertakers. One group provided the hands. The other provided the cover. And the boom provided the noise that kept the whole thing from being heard. The Osage lived inside this. They were rich beyond imagining, and surrounded on every side by people who wanted what they had. In a place where life was cheap and getting cheaper. They rode through it in their fine cars, watched and resented, protected by a law that had already decided they could not be trusted with their own money. One of them was a woman near Fairfax, keeping a household, raising children, holding her family together while the world pressed in. To understand what was about to be done to her, you have to meet her first. Mollie Kyle was born about 1886, on the reservation, into a family that had lived through the worst of the removals and come out the other side, still Osage. She was a full-blood. She grew up speaking Osage, and she spoke it all her life, even after English became the language of the money around her. She kept the old ways. She also lived inside the new world the oil had built. Both things were true at once, and she carried them without apparent strain. By the early 1920s, she was a married woman with children, running a household on the prairie near the town of Fairfax. She kept a home. She managed servants, a family, a budget. She was, by every ordinary measure, a capable adult, and she was not allowed to spend her own money without a white man's approval. That is not a figure of speech. Mollie had a court-appointed guardian. To draw a large sum from her own oil income, she had to go to that man and ask, and he had to sign. A woman who ran a household was presumed, in law, unable to manage a bank account. The reason on file was short. She was a full-blood Osage. In the county's eyes, that was the entire diagnosis. Set that beside what her family was worth. Mollie was one of 4 sisters, the daughters of a woman the records call Lizzie. There was Anna, the eldest, headstrong and unhappy, married and then not. There was Rita, the steady one, married to a white man named Bill Smith. There was Minnie, the youngest, and there was Mollie in the middle, the one who held the family together. They were, by every account that survives, a close family, and an Osage one. Their mother Lizzie had been born into a world before the allotments and the oil, when the Osage still lived by older rhythms. Her daughters came up inside the boom, in fine houses in the modern county, and yet they kept the language and the old ties. Mollie moved between the two worlds without losing either. She could sit at a full table in a large house, and she could speak the words her mother spoke, and both were home. This matters, because it is what was destroyed. The story is often told as a crime about money, and it is that. But the thing the money bought its way into was a family, a specific set of people who loved one another, gathered for meals, raised children side by side, and buried their dead by their own customs. When the killing gets described in numbers, headrights and estates and payouts, it is easy to lose the shape of what a headright actually was. It was a person, Anna, headstrong and alive, Rita, married and building a home, Minnie, the youngest, already gone, Lizzie, who remembered the older world, and Mollie, holding them together, about to watch each of them converted, one by one, from a person into an inheritance. They were not the only such family in the county, which is its own part of the horror. Across Osage County in these years were dozens of households like the Kyles, wealthy, close, full blood, restricted, and quietly surrounded. What happened to Mollie's family became the version that was finally investigated and named. It stood in for many that never were. Each of them held a headright. So did their mother. In one family, then, sat 5 full shares of the richest oil trust in the country, plus whatever they had already inherited from relatives who had died before them. By the standards of the day, they were rich beyond ordinary meaning, and every share they held was governed by that single rule from the first chapter. It could not be sold. It could only be inherited, which meant that within this one family, the death of any sister would push her share toward the others. Keep the shape of that in mind. It is a small family. The shares are large, and the only door the shares can pass through is death. The dying had, in fact, already started. It just did not look like dying yet. In 1918, Minnie, the youngest sister, fell ill. She was in her 20s. The sickness was strange. She wasted, weakened, and died within a short time, and the word the doctors reached for was a vague one, a peculiar wasting illness. No one was alarmed in the way they should have been. People still died young in those years, of many things, and a grieving family does not reach first for the idea of murder. Minnie was buried. Her headright passed to her mother and her sisters. The family was smaller, and the surviving shares were larger, and at the time, those two facts seemed to have nothing to do with each other. Only later, when people went back and counted, did Minnie's death take its place in a longer line. Around the sisters stood the usual crowd that Osage wealth attracted, and one member of that crowd matters more than the rest. His name was Ernest Burkhart. He was a white man from Texas, sandy and easygoing, not clever, well-liked. He had come to Osage County the way many young white men did, chasing the money in the air, and he had gone to work driving a hired car around Fairfax. He drove Mollie more than once. He learned a little Osage, and in 1917, Mollie Kyle and Ernest Burkhart married. By the record, it was a real marriage. They had children. Mollie loved him, as far as anyone could tell, and he seems, in his shapeless way, to have loved her. He was also the nephew of the most powerful white man in that part of the county, a rancher named William Hale, who had helped set the young man up and kept him close. At the time, that connection looked like good fortune for Ernest. A poor Texas driver had married into an Osage family and stood near a rich and generous uncle. Nobody watching the wedding would have read it as anything else. The record would read it differently. But the record was not finished being written. For now, hold the ordinary picture. Mollie kept house near Fairfax. She had a husband and children she cared for. She had her mother, Lizzie, aging now, and her two living sisters, Anna and Rita, close by. She had money she was not trusted to touch. She also had diabetes, and so she was used to doctors, used to regular visits, used to letting a physician put a needle in her arm, and trusting that what was in it would help her. Hold that detail lightly, it comes back. She lived, in other words, an entirely explicable life. A wealthy Osage woman, watched over by a guardian she did not need, married to an amiable white man with a powerful uncle, mourning a young sister lost to a sickness no one could name. Every piece of that sentence was a fact. Several of those facts were also instruments. Mollie could not yet see which was which, and neither, at first, could anyone else. That is the quiet horror sitting under this whole chapter of her life. Nothing looked wrong. The wrongness was structural. It was in the law that called her incompetent. It was in the rule that made her sisters worth more to their heirs dead than alive. It was in the closed list of names, and the short row of shares, and the amiable man at her table who answered to someone else. She was not living before the danger. She was already living inside it. The danger simply had not spoken yet. When it did, it would not announce itself as danger. It would arrive as an accident, in a ravine, on a hot day in May. The law that made all of it possible has a date, March 3rd, 1921. On that day, Congress passed an act aimed directly at the Osage and their money. On its face, it was written as protection. Underneath, it was a set of locks, and the Osage were on the wrong side of them. The act drew a line through the tribe by blood. An Osage of half or more Osage ancestry was presumed to need help managing money, unless a court granted that person a certificate of competency. Without the certificate, the Osage was ruled restricted. A restricted Osage did not receive the full headright income. The income went instead to a guardian, a local person the county court appointed, and the guardian released only a limited allowance each year, a few $1,000s, doled out from a fortune that might run to tens of thousands, out of money that already, indisputably, belonged to the Osage whose name was on the share. Read who ended up on each side of that line, and the protection story falls apart. Full-blood Osage were, almost without exception, denied certificates and kept restricted. Osage, of mixed ancestry, and white spouses were far more likely to be ruled competent and set free with their money. The test was not competence. The test was blood. The more Osage you were, the less the law let you touch what was yours. Look closely at what that allowance meant from day to day, because the cruelty lived in the detail. A grown Osage worth a fortune might be handed only a few $1,000s a year of it, in small pieces, while the rest piled up in accounts they were forbidden to touch. They were made to live like children on pocket money, drawn from their own wealth, and to ask permission for anything more. And asking was its own trap. Every real purchase needed the guardian's signature. He could refuse. He could delay. He could approve it only if it ran through a store he owned or a friend he favored, at a price marked up for the privilege. The Osage paid, out of their own money, for the right to spend their own money, and the difference stuck to the guardian's hands on the way through. There was, on paper, a way out. An Osage could be granted a certificate of competency that lifted the restrictions. But the certificate followed the same twisted logic as everything else. Full-bloods were rarely given it and stayed restricted for life. And for those who did receive it, freedom became a different danger, because a newly competent Osage, suddenly holding an entire fortune with no oversight, made a fat target for every swindler and false suitor in the county. Restricted, you were robbed slowly by your guardian. Competent, you were robbed quickly by everyone else. The law had built a room with two doors, and both opened onto the same fall. Multiply that across the county, and the size of the business comes clear. A single guardian might hold a dozen Osage estates at once, each one a stream of oil money, and take his cut from all of them together. Guardianship was not a duty the leading men shouldered out of kindness. It was a prize they competed for. Lawyers, bankers, and merchants lined up for the appointments, because there was no better money in Osage County than the money of the Osage. The guardians were not doctors or social workers. They were the leading white men of the county: lawyers, bankers, merchants, ranchers. Men who already ran the town now also ran the fortunes of the people they lived beside. A single guardian could hold the estates of many Osage at once. Each estate was a stream of oil money, and the guardian sat astride all of them, taking fees, approving purchases, deciding what an adult human being was permitted to buy. What that felt like, day to day, is its own kind of record. Grown men and women, some of the richest people in America, had to walk into an office and ask a white man for their own money. They asked to buy cars, and were told what car. They asked for money to travel, to bury a relative, to see a doctor, and they waited on a signature. The humiliation was not a side effect. For many of the guardians, keeping the Osage small and asking was part of the point, and the system produced moments that would be comic if they were not the machinery of theft. In one documented case, a court ruled an Osage woman incompetent to handle her money using a peculiar piece of evidence. She had saved too much of it. Her thrift, the reasoning went, showed she did not understand the value of money, and therefore needed a guardian to spend it for her. Save your money, and you prove you cannot be trusted with it. There was no answer that worked. The verdict came first, and the reasons were assembled to fit. Once a guardian controlled an estate, the ways to bleed it were endless and mostly legal. Guardians charged fees for their services, and the fees were generous. They bought goods for their wards at inflated prices, sometimes from stores they themselves owned, pocketing the difference. They steered their ward's money into investments that happened to benefit the guardian and lost the rest with no consequence. The oil money went out into the county and did not come back, and the paperwork stayed just clean enough. This was not a secret even at the time. In 1924, the Department of the Interior looked into the guardianship program and charged roughly 24 guardians with fraud and corruption. That is a striking number. 24 officers of the court, in a single county, credibly accused of robbing the people they were appointed to protect. And here is what happened to them. Nothing. Every one of the accused settled quietly out of court and kept going. Not one was meaningfully punished. The message to every other guardian in the county was received exactly as sent. The money was there for the taking, and no one who mattered would stop you. The scale of it can be measured. By 1929, after years of scrutiny, after the murders had made national news, the guardianship system still held around $27 million of Osage money. That is what remained inside the machine at the end. What passed through it and out the sides over the boom years cannot be fully counted, because the men keeping the books were the men taking the cut. Now set the last piece in place, the piece that turns a system of theft into a system of death. A restricted Osage, ruled incompetent, could not simply be robbed forever. A living ward had rights, a family, a voice, however muffled. But the law had an answer for that too, and it is the answer everything in this story finally rests on. If a restricted Osage died before being granted competency, the guardian, or the guardian's allies, could move on the estate. Headrights passed to heirs. Guardians and the men around them had spent years positioning themselves as those heirs, through marriage, through wills, through friendship carefully cultivated. And a dead ward files no complaints. Follow that incentive to its floor. A living Osage ward was a slow, capped stream of fees and skimming, and a nuisance who might one day be ruled competent and walk away with everything. A dead Osage ward was the whole estate at once, the entire headright, the accumulated inheritances, delivered to the person best placed to claim it. The law had quietly made the Osage worth more to the men around them dead than alive. It had done this in writing. It had done this in the name of protection. No one had to conspire to feel that pull. It was built into the structure, sitting there, waiting for anyone willing to act on arithmetic. Most people, of course, would never kill for money, no matter how the incentive was arranged. The system did not need most people. It needed a few. And in Osage County, in those years, a few was more than enough. Mollie Kyle stood inside this machine, like everyone else. She was restricted. She had a guardian. Her family's shares, her mother's, her sister's, her own, were all governed by these same locks, all bleeding fees, all sitting behind the same terrible door that only opened one way. The law had loaded the county. It had put a fortune behind every full-blood name, ruled each name too incompetent to guard it, and told the ambitious men of the town that the fortune came loose on death. It had built the motive. What it needed now was a man with the nerve to organize the rest. In Osage County, that man already had a nickname. They called him the King. Almost everyone in Osage County knew William Hale, and for a long time almost everyone liked him. He had not been born to anything. He came out of Texas around the turn of the century, a cowhand with no money and a hard childhood behind him, and he built himself up in the Osage country by force of will. He ran cattle. He leased grassland from the Osage, thousands of acres of it, and grew that lease into a fortune of his own. By the 1920s, he was one of the richest and most important white men in the county, and he had done it, as he liked people to remember, with his own two hands. He wanted more than money. He wanted to be loved, and he arranged to be. He gave to churches and to schools. He helped bury the poor. He lent money to people in trouble and did not always press to be repaid. He learned to speak some Osage and made a show of his friendship with the tribe. He got himself made a reserve deputy sheriff, so that the law and William Hale wore the same coat. People called him the King of the Osage Hills, and he did not discourage it. That reputation was not a disguise he put on for a single crime. It was the work of decades, and it was the most valuable thing he owned. A man everyone trusted could do things in plain sight that a suspected man could never do. He could sit at a funeral he had arranged. He could comfort a family he was destroying. He could offer, helpfully, to look into a death he had ordered. The good name was not a cover for the machine. The good name was part of the machine. There is a temptation to think a man like that must have looked like a villain. He did not, and that is the unsettling part. Hale was genial in person and generous in public, quick with a handshake and a loan. He sat on civic boards. He was a friend to churches and a soft touch for the poor. In a county learning to fear its own shadows, he was, to most people, a reassuring figure, proof that a hard country could still produce a good and successful man. Beneath the warmth, he was without limit. He treated the Osage around him as obstacles or instruments, never as people whose lives weighed anything against his ambition. Somewhere along the way, he had decided that their wealth was misplaced, and that a capable white man might reasonably correct the error, and he built a life around that correction. He did not rage over it. He did not agonize. He organized. The coldness in the record is not the coldness of a monster in a story. It is the coldness of a businessman who had classed certain human beings as inventory and kept his books accordingly. And his power, whatever face it wore, was total in the ways that mattered here. He could get a man a job, a loan, a second chance. He could get a man killed. He was owed favors up and down the county by people whose work was to enforce the law and certify the dead. By the 1920s, in that country, crossing William Hale was widely understood to be a way to shorten your life. Underneath it, Hale had built a second kind of power, quieter and more useful. He was owed. Across the county, men were in his debt, literally and otherwise. Small criminals relied on him for money and protection. Officials relied on him for favors. Bootleggers, cattle thieves, drifters, and hard cases drifted through his orbit, and Hale kept them close, because a man who is owed by the desperate has a workforce whenever he needs one, and he almost never did the thing himself. This is the part of Hale worth understanding, because it is why he was so hard to catch. He gave money and instructions. Other men supplied the hands. He would decide that a person should die and set a price, and let the county's supply of desperate men take it from there. Between Hale and the act, there were always 2 or 3 other people, each of whom could be paid, threatened, or, if it came to it, killed in turn. He built distance into everything. He treated murder the way he treated cattle. It was logistics. Now place his family into the picture, because that is where the plan lived. Hale had a nephew named Ernest Burkhart, the amiable Texas driver from the last chapter, the one who married Mollie Kyle. Hale had helped bring Ernest to the county and kept him near. He had another nephew there too, Ernest's younger brother, a reckless young man named Brian. Through Ernest's marriage, Hale had a thread running directly into a wealthy, full-blood family, the Kyles, a household holding several headrights and standing to inherit more. Follow the thread the way Hale followed it. Ernest was married to Mollie. If Mollie's mother and sisters died, their headrights would flow, by that one-way door, toward the surviving members of the family, and above all, toward Mollie. And if Mollie then died, everything she had gathered, her own share, and all the shares that death had pushed her way, would pass to her husband and her children, to Ernest, which was to say, into reach of Ernest's uncle. The whole grim engine was already sitting in the law. Hale's contribution was to read it clearly and to have the nerve and the men to run it. He did not need to invent a motive. The government had printed the motive in 1921. He only had to arrange the order of deaths, keep himself 3 men away from each one, and wear his good name through every funeral. There is a temptation, telling this, to make Hale into a kind of monster of legend, larger than life. The record does not support the legend. It supports something worse, because it is ordinary. Hale was not a genius. He was a greedy, vain, self-made man who had decided that the people around him were things, and who lived in a place and a time that agreed with him closely enough to let it happen. The county's contempt for the Osage was his cover. The county's corruption was his tool. The law's cruelty was his motive. He supplied only the willingness. And he had one more advantage, the one that would make the next several years a nightmare with no exit. He had reached into the very machinery meant to investigate a suspicious death. Local officers were his friends or his debtors. Undertakers, doctors, and prosecutors moved within his web. So when an Osage died strangely, the machine that should have asked hard questions was staffed, in part, by his people. Inquests came back clean. Evidence went missing. Witnesses reconsidered. A death would be ruled a drunken accident or a bad heart, and the paperwork would agree, and the case would close before it opened. That was the county Mollie Kyle lived in. Rich, watched, restricted, and surrounded. Her husband answered to his uncle. Her guardian answered to money. The sheriff, the coroner, the courts, all sat within reach of the king of the Osage Hills. Everything was in place. The wealth, the law, the motive, the men, the cover. All that remained was to start and to see whether anyone with the power to stop it would care enough to try. In May of 1921, it started, with Mollie's own sister. Do the arithmetic the way the killers did it, coldly, on paper, with the family as figures in a column. Start with the Kyle sisters and their mother. 5 people, 5 headrights, plus whatever shares had already drifted in from earlier deaths. Call it, in the money of the day, tens of thousands of dollars every year, flowing in for as long as all 5 drew breath, split 5 ways. Now start removing names and watch the column. Minnie was already gone, dead in 1918, of the sickness no one named. Her share had not vanished. It had moved to her mother and her surviving sisters, because that is the only direction a headright can move. The living were already richer for a death nobody had questioned. Take the next name. If Anna dies, her share does not leave the family. It concentrates, pooling into the survivors. Take the mother, Lizzie. If she dies, her headright and everything she has gathered comes down to her daughters. Take Rita, another death, another concentration. With each name removed, the money does not shrink. It thickens, running into a smaller and smaller number of hands. Follow the column to the bottom, and you arrive at a single person. If the mother and all the sisters die, everything they ever held, 5 headrights and more, folds into the last one standing. In this family, by design, that last person was meant to be Mollie, and Mollie was married to Ernest Burkhart. There it is, the whole engine, in plain numbers. Kill the mother and the sisters, in an order careful enough to look like misfortune, and you funnel a mountain of oil money into Mollie. Then, when the time is right, Mollie dies too, and all of it, the entire concentrated fortune, passes to her husband and their children, to Ernest, to Hale's blood. The Kyle women were not being murdered at random. They were being spent, in sequence, to move money to the end of a line that terminated in Hale's own family. That is the arithmetic. It is not complicated. That is the horror of it. A child could follow it. It only required someone willing to read a family as a payout schedule. The headrights were the largest prize, but they were not the only one, and the killers used every instrument the times offered. There was life insurance. A man could take out a policy on another person's life and name himself the one who collected when that person died. So the killers did. In the most documented case, Hale arranged to hold a $25,000 life insurance policy on a healthy young Osage man named Henry Roan, a policy that would pay Hale, and only Hale, the day Roan died. $25,000 on the life of a man in good health, held by the richest rancher in the county. A policy like that is not protection. It is a countdown with a signature on it. There was marriage. Again and again in these years, white men married Osage women who held or stood to inherit headrights and positioned themselves as the natural heirs. Rita Kyle had married a white man, Bill Smith. Mollie had married Ernest. The pattern was common enough that the Osage saw it clearly and grimly. A sudden courtship of a wealthy Osage woman was not always romance. Sometimes it was estate planning, conducted with flowers. And there was the guardianship itself, always underneath, quietly skimming, while the larger plays developed. And there was medicine, turned inside out. The surest way to kill an Osage without consequence was not a bullet, which leaves a hole and a question, but poison, which leaves a diagnosis. For that, the killers needed doctors, and in Osage County they had them. Cooperative physicians could supply a slow poison in place of a treatment, then sign the death certificate that called the result a wasting illness or a weak heart. The same doctors could perform an autopsy clumsily enough to bury the evidence, exactly as happened with Anna. A physician's signature could turn a murder into a natural death on paper, permanently. It is hard to overstate the power that placed in a few compromised hands. The people the Osage trusted to heal them could, with a syringe and a signature, kill them and certify it as fate. That is why so many of the Osage dead did not die dramatically. They faded. They sickened over weeks and months under regular medical care and slipped away, looking like the naturally unlucky. Mollie's own mother had gone that way. Mollie herself was going that way, slowly, even now, under a doctor's supervision. The method was quiet by design, because quiet was safe, and the men who chose it understood that a grave asks fewer questions than a gunshot. Put those tools together, and you have a complete kit for turning Osage lives into cash. Headrights that concentrate through death, insurance that pays on death, marriages that inherit through death, guardianships that profit either way. Every single instrument pointed in the same direction, and the direction was a grave. Here is the thought that should sit heaviest, and it is the one the famous version tends to lose. What Hale was doing to the Kyle family was organized, deliberate, and unusually thorough. But the arithmetic underneath it was not special to Hale. The same math sat under every restricted Osage in the county. Every full blood with a headright was, to the right kind of neighbor, a sum that could be collected early. Every guardian, every white spouse, every man who had loaned money against an Osage estate had, sitting in front of him, the same quiet equation that the law had written and refused to erase. Most of them never acted on it. That must be said plainly and kept in view. The machine did not turn every white citizen of Osage County into a murderer. But it did not need to. It only needed the ones who would, and it made sure that anyone who did would find the odds arranged in their favor. A cooperative sheriff, a friendly coroner, a jury of neighbors who thought a dead Indian was a smaller loss than a live one. So while this chapter of the story wears Hale's face, keep a wider frame in the corner of your eye. The Kyle murders were the part that got a villain and a trial. The arithmetic was everywhere. And when investigators finally went back, years later, and looked at the county's death records with open eyes, they would find that the killing had not been confined to one family or one scheme at all. They would find it scattered across the whole reservation, in dozens of deaths that had been signed off, at the time, as nothing worth a second look. That reckoning was still years away. In the spring of 1921, the arithmetic was fresh, the county was calm, and Mollie Kyle had a mother and 2 living sisters. By the end of that spring, she would have 1 sister fewer. On the 27th of May, 1921, 2 men in a ravine north of Fairfax found the body of a woman. She had lain there for days in the heat. It was Anna Brown, Mollie's older sister, who had been missing for about a week. Anna had last been seen after a family gathering. Among the people with her in her final hours was William Burkhart, the younger nephew of William Hale, brother to Mollie's husband Ernest. He had driven her around that day and, by his account, dropped her safely home. Then she was gone, and then she was in the ravine. From here, the record turns cold, because the failure was not an accident of a rough frontier. It was a choice. The first ruling leaned toward nothing at all. Perhaps she had been drinking. Perhaps she had wandered off and died of exposure. A death like that asked nothing of anyone. It closed itself. But Anna's body, even ruined by days in the sun, held a fact that would not close so easily. When she was finally examined, there was a bullet in her head, fired from behind. Anna Brown had not wandered off and died. She had been shot in the back of the head and left in a creek bed. Whoever arranged the cover then made a second move, and it was clever. The examination of Anna's body was carried out by 2 local doctors, brothers, who moved within Hale's world. The autopsy they performed was crude past the point of incompetence. The body was cut into roughly. The search for the bullet was clumsy, and the small slug that could have been evidence was handled in a way that destroyed much of its value. Whether through haste, indifference, or design, the one piece of physical proof was degraded almost as soon as it was found. That is the shape of it, and this account will not linger on the body. The point is not the wound. The point is what the wound proves. It proves that from the very first killing, the machine that was supposed to answer a suspicious Osage death was not neutral. It was staffed, in places that mattered, by people who benefited from the answer being nothing. And Anna was not alone that week. Around the same days, an Osage man named Charles Whitehorn, who had been missing about as long, was found near Pawhuska, also shot in the head. 2 Osage, 2 bullets, 2 bodies, inside a single week, in a single small county. Whitehorn, too, held a headright. His death, too, produced no serious inquiry. Any honest observer, laying those 2 deaths side by side, would have seen a pattern and demanded answers. The county did not. The inquests went through their motions and produced nothing. No serious suspect was pursued. The cases were allowed to cool. The message to whoever had done this could not have been clearer. Killing in Osage carried, in Osage County, almost no risk at all. It is worth pausing on Anna herself, because she is so easily reduced to the first name on a list. She was a grown woman with a life of her own, sharp-tongued, recently divorced, fond of company and a drink, unhappy in the ordinary ways people are unhappy. In the language of the county's contempt, she was an easy victim to look away from, a rich Osage woman who drank and kept late hours. That contempt was itself a tool. It let the first ruling stick. A woman like that, the reasoning went, might well have come to a bad end on her own. The killers had chosen well, and they had counted on the county caring about Anna exactly as little as they did. The county obliged. Think about what a serious investigation would have required, and how little of it happened. Anna had been in the company of William Burkhart in her final hours, a fact known and available. The bullet, however clumsily recovered, put murder beyond argument. Charles Whitehorn lay shot in the same few days. Any officer with the will to look had threads to pull. No one pulled them. The evidence was mishandled into uselessness. The witnesses who mattered were tied to the very men who should have been suspected. The inquiry did not fail for lack of clues. It failed because the people running it did not want it to succeed. For the family, the ruling landed as something worse than grief. Grief has an object and an end. This had neither. Anna had been murdered. That much was now certain, and the system that was supposed to answer a murder had simply declined to. Mollie was left holding a truth no one in power would share, that her sister had been killed, on purpose, by someone, for some reason, and that the county did not intend to learn who or why. That is a particular kind of fear. It is the fear of realizing that the institutions around you have quietly agreed not to protect you. The Osage were beginning to feel it settle over the whole county. If Anna's death could be waved away, so could the next one, and there would be a next one. For Mollie, Anna's death was the beginning of a private education in that fact. She had lost Minnie 3 years before, to a sickness. Now Anna was dead by a bullet, and no one in authority seemed to care to find out why. Mollie was a grieving woman, restricted by law, married into the family of the very man arranging her ruin, though she did not yet know the last part. She could not run the investigation the county refused to run, but she could refuse to let it drop. She began to press. She spent her own money, when her guardian would release it, on private investigators. She pushed relatives and Osage leaders to keep asking. And there was her mother. Lizzie, already aging, already unwell, went further downhill after Anna's death. Within 2 months of Anna's body being found, Lizzie too was dead. At the time, her death was written down as ordinary. She was old. She was sick. She grieved. Old, sick, grieving women die. But Lizzie had been declining in a particular way, a slow wasting that later investigators would come to recognize, and there would be strong reason to believe that Lizzie, like her daughter Minnie before her, had not simply died. She had been helped toward it, slowly, by poison, in her own home, by people she trusted to feed and doctor her. Set the ledger of that first summer against the arithmetic from the last chapter. In a matter of weeks, the Kyle family had lost Anna to a bullet and Lizzie to a slow decline. 2 more headrights had come loose. 2 more shares had folded inward, toward the survivors, toward Mollie, toward the line that ended at Ernest Burkhart and his uncle. The column was shrinking exactly as the arithmetic predicted, and the deaths were being signed off, one by one, as bad luck. The official record of that summer said accident, said old age, said nothing to see. The truer record, assembled painfully and much later, said something colder. The plan was running, it was working, and the machinery of the county, the doctors, the coroners, the officers, was not failing to stop it. In the parts that counted, it was helping. Mollie could feel the walls of it without being able to name the architect. She was burying her family and being told each grave was a coincidence. She kept asking anyway. Asking, in Osage County, was about to become the most dangerous thing a person could do. The killing had a second layer, and the second layer is the one that turned a string of murders into a reign of terror. It was aimed not at the Osage who held the money, but at anyone who tried to find out who was taking it. As the deaths mounted, the Osage did not sit silent. They were not passive victims waiting to be rescued. They organized. The tribal council met and passed resolutions. They pooled money and hired private detectives. They sent men to Washington to demand that the federal government step in, because it had become obvious that the local government never would. And the people who carried those efforts forward began to die. Consider a man named Barney McBride. He was a wealthy oilman, white, a friend to the Osage, and in 1922, the tribe asked him to go to Washington to plead for a federal investigation. He went. He never got the chance to make the case. Near the capital, 1,000 miles from Osage County, McBride was murdered, his body left in a culvert as a message that could not be misread. Reach for the federal government, and we can reach you anywhere. Consider an attorney named W. W. Vaughn. He worked to gather evidence about the killings. He was in contact with an Osage man named George Bighart, who had fallen gravely ill, poisoned, and who believed he knew things about who was behind the deaths. From his hospital bed, Bighart called Vaughn and asked him to come. Vaughn went to hear what the dying man knew. Bighart died, and on the train home, carrying whatever he had learned, Vaughn was thrown from the moving car. He was found dead beside the tracks, stripped of the papers he had been carrying. Both men, the one who knew and the one who came to listen, were gone within days of each other. The pattern held with a terrible consistency. To investigate the murders was to be marked. To be a witness was to be a target. People who might testify sickened suddenly, or met with accidents, or simply disappeared. The county learned the lesson the killers were teaching. Curiosity was fatal. Silence was survival. And so a whole community fell quiet, not because it did not know, but because it had watched what happened to those who spoke. The killers even turned the second layer on their own. This is one of the coldest details in the whole record, and it tells you what kind of operation this was. Henry Grammer, a bootlegger and criminal who had helped supply the men and the means for the murders, died in a sudden car crash in June of 1923. Days later, Asa Kirby, another accomplice, the man tied to the worst of the violence, was shot dead while robbing a store after, by the evidence, Hale himself had tipped off the store's owner to expect a burglar and be ready to shoot. The men who did the dirty work were being erased by the man who had hired them, so that the chain from the act back to Hale would have no living links. Now stop and look at what has actually been described, because this is the hinge of the whole story. The familiar version of these events is a detective story. A wicked man, William Hale, murders a family for their oil money, and a heroic investigation eventually brings him down. That version is not false, but it is far too small, and its smallness is a kind of lie. Widen the frame, and a different thing comes into view. This was not one villain killing one family. It was a machine with many operators, protected by the county's own institutions, that killed the wealthy, killed the witnesses, killed the investigators, and killed its own soldiers to keep the secret, all while the official paperwork recorded accidents and natural causes. The question was never really who killed Anna Brown. The question the record forces on you is larger and worse. How many Osage died this way? Across how many schemes? Run by how many different men? In a place where killing them was safe? The Kyle murders were the piece that eventually got a name and a trial. They were never the whole of it. That is the reframe the honest record demands. Hale was not the disease. Hale was the most organized symptom of a disease that had been written into law and woven into a county. When people finally went back and counted, they did not find 24 deaths. They found far more. And most of those other deaths never had a Hale to blame, because they never needed one. They only needed the arithmetic, and a guardian or a spouse or a neighbor willing to use it, and a coroner who would sign. For the Osage living through it, the reframe was not a historical insight. It was daily life. They could not tell which of the white men around them, the merchants, the guardians, the friendly rancher, the husband, were dangerous. Any of them might be. Some of them were. They lived in a community that looked normal and functioned, underneath, as a trap. They locked their doors. They were afraid of their food. They noticed that people who visited a doctor sometimes got worse. They stopped trusting the very things that are supposed to be safe: medicine, marriage, the law, because in Osage County, each of those had been turned into a weapon. The fear reshaped ordinary life into something unrecognizable. Families who could afford the finest of everything grew afraid to eat food they had not prepared with their own hands. People who fell ill wondered whether they were sick or being killed, and hesitated to see the doctors who were meant to help them, because the doctors could not be trusted either. Some Osage left the county altogether, moving away from the oil and the danger, trying to put distance between themselves and whatever was hunting them. Others added locks, kept guns close, stopped going out after dark. At night, in the wealthiest community in America, people lay awake listening. The oil had bought them mansions and cars and servants, and it had bought them a fear that money could not answer, because the money was the reason for the fear. The cruelest part was the uncertainty. A stranger can be guarded against, but the Osage could not know which of the familiar faces around them belonged to the machine. The friendly rancher might be arranging your death. The husband beside you might be feeding you poison a little at a time. The doctor might be killing you by the spoonful. The guardian, counting your money, had every reason to want you gone. Trust, the ordinary glue that holds a community together, had been turned into the central danger of Osage life. They could not live without extending it, and they could not extend it without risking everything. Mollie was living at the exact center of that fear. Her mother was dead. 2 of her sisters were dead. She had 1 sister left, Rita, and a husband she still trusted, and a body that, unknown to her, was beginning to fail in ways her doctors were not fixing. She kept pushing for an investigation. She kept spending what her guardian would let her spend to find the truth. The machine noticed, and it decided that the pressure Mollie and the Osage were generating had grown large enough to require a demonstration. Not another quiet poisoning, not another lonely body in a field. Something loud, something that would tell the entire county, in a single night, that there was no floor beneath this, no line the killers would not cross. They chose Rita's house, and they chose to do it with an explosion. There is a single piece of paper at the center of this chapter, and it is the closest thing the entire case has to a confession written in advance. It was a life insurance policy. The insured man was Henry Roan, an Osage in his 40s, a relative and old friend of Mollie's family. The person who would collect the money when Roan died was William Hale. Understand how strange that arrangement is before going further. Life insurance exists so that a person can protect the people who depend on them. A man insures his own life so his wife and children are cared for when he is gone. But Henry Roan did not take out this policy to protect his family. William Hale took it out, on Roan's life, to enrich William Hale. $25,000, payable to a wealthy rancher, on the death of a healthy man who was no relation to him at all. Hale built the arrangement patiently, the way he built everything. Roan had money troubles and a fondness for drink, and Hale made himself the answer to both. He was Roan's friend. He lent Roan money, over $1,000 of it. He presented himself to the insurers and to the county as a man with a legitimate financial interest in Roan's life, a creditor protecting a loan. On that pretext, he arranged the policy and quietly made himself its sole beneficiary. On paper, it looked almost respectable. Underneath, it was a bounty, and Hale had posted it on a man who trusted him. In the early days of 1923, Hale called in the bounty. He turned to one of his dependable men, John Ramsey, and set the price. By the later testimony, Ramsey was promised around $500 and a car to do it. Ramsey got Roan drinking, as so many of these killings began, with whiskey and false friendship. Then, in a quiet spot, he shot Roan from behind and left him in his car. This account will not dwell on the killing itself. Two sentences hold what matters. A trusting man was gotten drunk by a paid acquaintance and shot from behind for a fee and a car. The order came from the friend who had insured his life. Roan's body was found on the 6th of February, 1923. Then Hale did the thing that reveals him completely. He filed to collect the money. His friend had been found murdered, and William Hale went to the insurance company and asked for his $25,000. He was not embarrassed. He was not cautious. He had killed for the payout, and now he lined up to be paid, because in the world he had built, why would he not be? The county protected him. The law worked for him. The bodies of the Osage produced no consequences. Collecting was simply the last step, but this time the paper worked against him. An insurance company is not a county coroner. When a healthy insured man is murdered and a non-relative steps forward for a large payout, questions get asked by people who do not live in Osage County and do not answer to the king. The policy that was meant to turn Roan's death into cash became instead a documented link between Hale and a murder, a motive with his signature on it. Henry Roan deserves more than his part in the plot. He was a man in his 40s who had known real hardship, given to low spells and to drink, and he had come to regard William Hale as a true friend, one of the few white men in the county he trusted. That trust was not incidental to his death. It was the method of it. Hale cultivated Roan's friendship precisely so that he could stand close enough to ensure his life, and, when the time came, to end it. Roan died believing the man who had arranged his murder was the man looking out for him. That pattern, trust turned into a weapon, runs through every killing in this story. The Osage were not murdered by strangers in the dark. They were murdered by husbands, friends, doctors, and neighbors, by the people closest to them, because closeness was exactly what the scheme required. It is a grim thing to mark, but worth it. Hale killed by making himself necessary to his victims, and he was undone, in the end, by the one victim whose death he had put in writing beforehand. The bullet that killed Anna left the county almost nothing to use. The policy that killed Roan left a trail the county could not fully control, because it ran through an institution beyond the county's reach. Hale's greed had finally produced a piece of evidence his power could not simply make disappear. There was a second piece of luck buried in the Roan killing, though no one recognized it yet, and it would matter more than the insurance. Henry Roan had been murdered on a particular kind of land. His allotment was held in trust, restricted land, under federal authority rather than local. A killing there was not only a matter for the county that Hale controlled. It was, potentially, a federal crime, on federal ground, beyond the reach of the sheriff and the coroner, who had buried every other case. Hold that fact. When the county's grip finally had to be broken, it would be broken here, on the jurisdiction of the ground where Roan died. The very remoteness Hale chose to hide the killing would become the doorway the federal government walked through to reach him. None of that was visible in 1923. What was visible was that the killings had grown bolder. A man had been insured like livestock and shot for the payout, and the man who did it was walking into offices asking to be paid. The Osage saw it. Mollie saw it. Her own family circle was nearly gone now. Anna, Minnie, her mother, and now Roan, a man she had known her whole life. Only Rita was left, of the sisters. Rita and her husband, Bill Smith, in their house in Fairfax. Bill Smith was not a fool. He had watched the family around his wife be emptied out, one death at a time. And he had started to say aloud what everyone was afraid to say, that the deaths were murders, and that they were connected, and that he intended to find out who was behind them. He moved his household, changed his habits, tried to stay ahead of whatever was coming. The machine had shown it could be quiet, with poison, and quick, with a bullet. For Bill Smith, who was making noise, it chose to be loud. It happened in the small hours of the 10th of March, 1923. Most of Fairfax was asleep. Then the town came off its beds. A blast tore through the night, so large that people blocks away thought at first that a gas line had gone or that the world had ended. Windows broke across the neighborhood. A glow rose where a house had been. When the dust settled, the home of Bill and Rita Smith was simply gone, collapsed into a burning pit, as though a piece of the ground had been bitten out. The bomb had been enormous, packed with enough explosive to erase a house rather than merely damage it. This was not a quiet poisoning meant to pass for illness. It was the opposite. It was designed to be seen, heard, and understood by everyone. A single sentence, written in fire across the whole county. No one is safe, not even in their beds, not even behind a locked door. Inside had been 3 people. Rita Smith, Mollie's last sister, a servant who worked in the home, a young white woman named Nettie Brookshire, and Bill Smith, Rita's husband, the man who had been saying out loud that the deaths were murders and that he meant to expose them. Rita and the servant were killed outright. Bill Smith, terribly, did not die at once. He was pulled from the wreckage still alive and lingered for a few days before his injuries took him. Whatever he understood about who wanted him dead, he carried most of it with him. Look at what that single night accomplished for the machine. Bill Smith, the loudest voice against the killings, was silenced. Rita, the last of the Kyle sisters, was dead, which meant her headright, and the family's gathered fortune, now had only one place left to go, to Mollie, and through Mollie, by the arithmetic laid out earlier, toward Ernest Burkhart and his uncle. In one explosion, the plan had removed its most dangerous critic and completed almost the entire concentration of the family's wealth into the single person the killers had married into. Consider, too, what it did to everyone else. The bombing was not only an attack on the Smiths, it was a public announcement. The whole town had been thrown out of bed by it. Everyone in the county understood. The next morning, that a house full of sleeping people could be erased in an instant, and that the killers had grown confident enough to do it in the open, in the heart of a sleeping town, rather than quietly in a field. If any doubt had lingered that the deaths were connected, that they were murders, that someone powerful was arranging them, the crater where the Smith house had stood ended it. And still, even then, the local machinery produced no answer. No one was charged. The investigation went the way all the others had gone, which is to say nowhere. That was its own message, and it was the most frightening one of all. Quiet poison had gone unpunished. Lonely bullets had gone unpunished. Now a bomb in the heart of a town had gone unpunished. The lesson was total. There was no line the killers could cross that would force the local law to move, because the local law was part of the arrangement. Whatever was going to save the Osage, if anything could, would not be coming from Osage County. Sit with Mollie's position now, because it is nearly unbearable. In less than 3 years, she had lost her sister Minnie, her sister Anna, her mother Lizzie, her cousin Roan, and now her sister Rita, blown apart in her own home. Every close member of her birth family was dead. She herself was the last one standing, which the killers needed, because the fortune could only reach Ernest by first gathering in Mollie, and only then passing on through her. She was, for the moment, being kept alive precisely because she was the vessel. Her turn would come only when the money was safely pooled and the time was right. And Mollie was, by now, beginning to sicken. She had what her doctors treated as a diabetic condition. She received regular care, regular injections. And instead of improving under treatment, she was quietly growing weaker, fading much as her mother had before her. The vessel was already, carefully, being drained. That is the state of things. By 1923, a family destroyed, a community terrorized into silence, investigators and witnesses murdered, the local law complicit or afraid, and the survivor at the center of it, slowly being poisoned under the care of the people meant to heal her. The one thing the killers had not counted on was that the bombing was too loud. A quiet county of dead Indians could be ignored by the wider country. It had been, for years. But a house bombed off the earth in the middle of a town, on top of a mounting pile of murders, was national news. Newspapers carried it. The Osage renewed their demands with fresh urgency and fresh evidence of how far the killers would go. The pressure that the tribe had been building for years, the petitions, the money, the pleading in Washington, finally had behind it an image no one could look away from. The federal government, which had ignored the Osage for years, could no longer afford to. In 1925, the case was handed to a young and hungry agency in Washington, an agency looking for exactly this kind of headline. It was called The Bureau of Investigation. In time, it would be renamed. The world would come to know it as the FBI. For the first time, someone was coming to Osage County who did not answer to the king. The agency that finally took the case was, in 1925, barely an agency at all. The Bureau of Investigation was young, small, and not yet feared. It had a new leader, a driven young administrator named J. Edgar Hoover, who understood something about his own institution. It needed a victory. It needed a case that would prove a national police force could solve what local law could not, and turn the Bureau from a minor office into a power. The Osage murders, notorious, unsolved, and shameful, were exactly that kind of case. If the Bureau cracked them, it would matter. If it failed publicly, it might not survive. Hoover was cautious for another reason. An earlier, clumsier federal effort in Osage County had already gone wrong, badly enough to embarrass the Bureau. So this time, Hoover reached for a particular kind of man to run it, and the choice is one of the few clean notes in the whole record. His name was Tom White. He was a former Texas Ranger, a lawman of the older, plainer school, tall and unhurried, with a cowboy's hat and a straight way of speaking. He was not a modern investigator of the type Hoover would later prize. He was something more useful for this county. He was honest, in a place where honesty was scarce, and he could not be bought, in a place where nearly everyone had a price. White understood, from his first look at Osage County, the central obstacle in the case. The problem was not a lack of suspects. The problem was that the local machinery of justice belonged to the men he was hunting. He could not trust the sheriff. He could not trust the coroners who had signed the false rulings. He could not trust the local courts, or the county's leading citizens, because the leading citizen was very likely at the heart of the killing. Every ordinary channel an investigator would use was, in Osage County, a channel that ran back to William Hale. So White did not use them. He built a second, hidden investigation alongside the visible one. He brought in a small team of undercover agents and put them into the county wearing other lives. One posed as a cattle buyer, a natural enough figure in ranching country. One presented himself as an insurance salesman, moving door to door, listening. One was a former Texas Ranger who could pass among the county's hard men. And one was a Native American agent, a man named John Wren, who could go where no white lawman could and hear what the Osage would never say to an outsider. While Tom White worked in the open as the visible federal man, his hidden agents drifted through the county, gathering what the record had been denied for years. Ordinary talk, debts, grudges, who had been where, on which night, who had suddenly come into money, who feared whom. The undercover men could sit in a store, or a pasture, or a kitchen, and collect the pieces of truth that terror had scattered and silenced. It was slow, and it was dangerous. The people who could testify had a way of dying, and the agents knew it. Witnesses had to be found, protected, and kept alive long enough to matter. Some who might have spoken were already in their graves, killed precisely so this day would never come. The investigation was, in part, an act of recovery, trying to rebuild from fragments a truth that the killers had spent years dismantling. But the outsiders had two advantages Hale had never had to face. They were beyond his reach, and they were patient. He could not have them fired. He could not have their rulings changed. Killing a federal agent was a different order of risk than killing an Osage or a local attorney, and even Hale hesitated at it. For the first time, The machine was being studied by people it could not switch off. The work was painstaking, and it took years. Trust in Osage County had to be built one careful conversation at a time, because a single wrong word could cost a witness their life. The agents moved slowly on purpose. They learned the county's debts and grudges. They found the handful of people who had seen something and were still breathing, and they kept them alive and talking. They pieced together the movements of Hale's hired men on the nights that mattered. Where a criminal could be turned, they turned him, trading leniency for testimony, working their way up the chain from the men who had held the guns toward the man who had paid for them. None of it would have happened without the Osage themselves, and that deserves to be said plainly against the old picture of helpless victims waiting for rescue. The Osage had driven this for years. Their tribal council had passed formal resolutions demanding action. They had posted their own reward for information, thousands of dollars of their own money, on top of everything the guardianship system was already skimming. They had hired the private investigators, sent the delegations, buried the messengers, and refused to let the case die when everyone with local power wanted it buried. The Bureau finished the work. The Osage had kept it alive long enough to be finished. Their strategy sharpened around the weak point identified earlier. The murder of Henry Roan had happened on restricted land, under federal jurisdiction. That gave the national government clean authority to prosecute, in a federal court, outside the county's rigged local system, in front of a judge and jury that Hale did not own. The Roan killing, with its damning insurance policy pointing straight at Hale, became the spine of the federal case. And there was a human weak point too, closer to the center than any document. The whole scheme depended on a man who was not a hardened criminal at all. It depended on Ernest Burkhart, Mollie's husband, Hale's nephew, the amiable, weak driver who had married into the family and stood, on paper, to inherit everything the deaths had gathered. Ernest had gone along with terrible things out of greed and fear and loyalty to his uncle, but he was not made of the same iron as Hale. He could be frightened, he could be pressured, and if he broke, he could describe the machine from the inside. The Bureau set out to break him. In January of 1926, the arrests came. William Hale and John Ramsey were indicted for the murder of Henry Roan. After years in which not a single killing had produced a serious charge, the king was under federal indictment. The turn had come because the weak link had finally snapped. Ernest Burkhart broke. Under the steady pressure of the Bureau, confronted with what the agents had gathered, Mollie's husband began to talk. He admitted his part. He described the scheme. He implicated his own uncle. For the case, it was everything, because Ernest had stood inside the machine and could name its workings from within. A paid killer's word can be doubted. The word of the family member who was meant to inherit the fortune is another matter. But the confession did not hold cleanly, and the reason it wavered tells you how far Hale's power reached even now. Hale had money, and money bought the best defense in the region. His lawyers went to work not only in the courtroom but around it, on Ernest himself, pressuring him, reminding him where his loyalty and his safety lay. Ernest, weak as ever, wavered. He moved to take back his confession. For a time it looked as though the star witness might be pulled back into his uncle's orbit, and the case might collapse. That struggle over one frightened man was a small model of the whole trial to come, because when the case reached court, it became something rare and revealing. It became the machine itself, forced into the open, fighting for its life with every tool it had used in the dark. Watch what Hale's side did, and remember these were the methods that had worked in the county for years. Witnesses who had agreed to testify suddenly changed their accounts, or forgot what they had seen, or could not be found at all. People who knew things received visits, and money, and warnings. There were efforts to reach the jury, to buy a vote, to arrange the friendly outcome that Hale had always been able to arrange at home. The defense fought over where the trials would be held, seeking ground more favorable to the king. Cases stalled, tangled in appeals, ended in deadlock, and had to be tried again. At least one juror and several witnesses moved through the proceedings under a cloud of bribery and threat. Before any evidence could be weighed at all, there was a battle over whether a federal court had the right to hear the case. Hale's lawyers understood the ground perfectly. A local Oklahoma court sat closer to the county he controlled, and they fought to keep the case there. The government argued that because Henry Roan had been killed on restricted Osage land, held in federal trust, the crime answered to the federal government, not the county. That question sounds like a technicality. It was the whole war. It decided whether Hale would be judged inside the system he owned or outside it. The fight over it climbed all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, which ruled that the federal government did have the authority to try the case. Hale had come within one legal argument of never facing a jury at all, years after the murder, on a point of geography, and when the trials finally proceeded, they had to be fought more than once. Early efforts ran aground on tampered juries and shifting testimony. The defense argued that Ernest's confession had been beaten out of him, that the government's witnesses were liars and criminals, that the whole case was a frame. There were mistrials, there were retrials. For a time, it was genuinely unclear whether the most powerful man in the county could simply outlast and outspend the United States, wearing the case down through delay until it fell apart. The outcome that history now treats as inevitable did not feel inevitable to the people living it. It hung, for years, by a thread. Understand what that resistance proves. It is one thing to kill people in a county you control, with a coroner who signs and a sheriff who looks away. It is another to keep that power working under the lights of a federal courtroom, against agents you cannot fire and a government you cannot bribe wholesale. Hale nearly did it anyway. The same web of money and fear that had buried the murders for years came within reach of defeating the United States government in open court. That is the true measure of the machine. Not that it was finally beaten, but that beating it was so hard and came so late and so nearly failed. It did not fail, in the end, because Ernest held. Brought back from the edge, faced again with the evidence, he testified. He sat in a courtroom and told what his uncle had done, and his testimony, joined to the insurance policy and the patient work of the undercover agents, was enough. In the years that followed the first indictment, through retrials and appeals, the verdicts finally landed. Picture what that testimony actually was, because it is the strangest and most human moment in the whole case. Ernest Burkhart was not a good man who had stumbled. He had gone along with the murder of his wife's mother and sisters. He had helped poison Mollie herself, a little at a time. He stood to inherit the fortune all those deaths had gathered. And now, cornered and frightened, and finally out from under his uncle's shadow, he sat in a federal courtroom and described the machine from the inside, naming Hale, unwinding the scheme, piece by piece. He turned on his uncle to save himself, which is not courage, but the effect of it was to hand the Osage the one thing the county had denied them for years: a true account, spoken aloud, on the record, by someone who had been in the room. The whole structure of denial, the false rulings and the friendly coroners and the buried inquests, could not survive a single frightened insider telling the truth, in a place the king did not control. That is the thin thread the famous ending hangs from. Not a brilliant investigation alone, though the investigation was real. Not physical proof alone, though the insurance policy mattered. It came down, at the last, to whether one weak man would hold his account together long enough for it to count. He did, barely. And on that narrow margin, the case that history remembers as a clean triumph was won. William Hale was convicted of arranging the murder of Henry Roan. He was sentenced to life in prison and sent to the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth. John Ramsey, who had fired the shot, was convicted and sentenced to life as well. Ernest Burkhart, who had turned on the scheme he was meant to profit from, pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life for his own role. Kelsey Morrison, who had murdered Anna Brown, was convicted too. For the newspapers, that was the ending, and it was told as a triumph. The young bureau had gone into a lawless county and brought down its king. J. Edgar Hoover had his headline and his proof that a national police force could deliver justice where local law had failed. Tom White had done something genuinely admirable, at real risk, and had earned the credit. Later, in one of the quiet ironies the record preserves, White would even become the warden of Leavenworth, the very prison that held the man he had caught. The story, told that way, closes on a satisfying note. The villain is behind bars. The investigators are heroes. Justice, delayed and hard won, has arrived. And every word of that is true. It is simply not the whole truth, and the distance between the part that is true and the part that is missing is where the real weight of this history sits. Because for all its drama, the case that convicted William Hale accounted for only a handful of deaths. One murder was the spine of it. A few more hung around the edges. The men convicted could be counted on 2 hands. Set that against the length of the killing, the number of the dead, and the breadth of the county's complicity, and the triumph begins to look very small against the thing it was measured against. The Bureau had closed a case. It had not closed the account. And the difference between those two things is the last and hardest part of this record. The famous case ended with a handful of men in prison. The killing was never a handful. Here the record and the legend separate for good, and the gap between them is the real subject of this whole account. The number most often attached to the Osage reign of terror is about 24, roughly 24 murders, committed over the few years when the terror was at its height. That is the figure the newspapers settled on, the figure the trials seem to address, the figure that lets the story close. Now widen the window past those few years and look at the county with open eyes, the way investigators eventually did. Counting from around 1918 through the early 30s, the documented dead climbed towards 60. Nearly 60 wealthy Osage, killed or dead under circumstances suspicious enough that later researchers would not call them natural. And many of those cases were never solved, never charged, never explained. They were simply names with dates and a cause of death on paper that no longer holds up. They were not all Kyles, and that is the point most easily lost. Remember Charles Whitehorn, the Osage man found shot near Pawhuska on the very same day as Anna Brown, in a killing that had nothing to do with Mollie's family and was never answered either. Remember William Stepson, a champion roper, a strong young man, dead in 1922 of a poisoning dressed as sudden illness. There were others whose names survive only in the later files. An Osage poisoned with tainted whiskey. A woman who wasted away exactly as Lizzie and Minnie had. Men and women who died the week after a new will was signed, or a fresh insurance policy was taken out, or a white spouse grew impatient. The method matters because it is why the number can never be fixed. A bullet leaves a body and a question. Poison, given slowly by a trusted hand and signed off by a cooperative doctor as a wasting illness or a bad heart, leaves a grave and nothing else. Many of the Osage dead were not shot or bombed. They were poisoned, patiently, in their homes, and buried as the naturally unlucky. Even George Bighart, an Osage who believed he knew who was behind the killings, died of suspected poison before he could tell it, and the attorney who came to hear his account was dead within a day. The people who could have added names to the list kept being removed from it. Then go one step further, past what can be documented to what the pattern implies, and the ground drops away. Historians who have gone back through the county's death records have concluded that even 60 is almost certainly too low. The best known of them, David Gran, whose work brought this history back into public view, wrote that the true toll was likely not 24 and not 60, but in his words, scores if not hundreds. Death spread across more years and more schemes than the Hale case ever touched. Osage, who wasted away from unexplained illness. Osage, who died of poisonings recorded as bad hearts. Osage, whose money vanished into a guardian's accounts, and who then, conveniently, died. Be honest about what that means and does not mean. We do not have a clean final number. We never will. The whole method of these murders was to disguise them as ordinary death, and a killing dressed as a natural passing, signed off by a friendly doctor and buried without question, may leave no evidence at all a century later. The uncertainty is not a gap in the story. The uncertainty is the story. The killers were good enough, and the county was complicit enough, that the true scale of it was made permanently unrecoverable. When the record cannot tell you the number, that silence is itself the darkest kind of evidence. Set beside that scale the ledger of justice, and the imbalance is staggering. For all those dead, the men actually convicted amount to a tiny handful. William Hale, John Ramsey, Ernest Burkhart, a few others around the edges. Their crimes were real, and their convictions were earned, but they answer for one family and a few killings out of dozens, out of possibly hundreds. Nearly every other murder in this history went unpunished. No arrest, no trial, no name attached to the crime. The people who committed them grew old, in most cases, as respectable citizens, and died in their beds. And the financial killing, the quieter machine underneath, was barely touched at all. Remember the guardians. In 1924, 24 of them had been charged with defrauding the Osage, and every one had settled and walked away unpunished. That did not change. The men who bled the estates through fees and inflated prices and stolen investments were, with vanishing few exceptions, never held to account. By 1929, after everything, the guardianship system still sat on some $27 million that belonged to the Osage. The theft that did not require a bullet was never really prosecuted, because it was legal and because the men who ran it were the county. It is worth weighing the two crimes against each other. The murders took dozens of lives, perhaps far more, and they are rightly the heart of this story. But the quiet financial killing, the guardianships and the skimming and the inflated bills and the vanished investments robbed the Osage of sums that dwarf any single estate, millions upon millions, taken not at gunpoint but by signature, year after year, from people the law had declared unable to protect themselves. The murders were the sharp edge of the theft. The theft was the larger crime, and it was the one that walked away almost entirely clean, because it never had to hide. That is the part hardest to hold, because it does not fit the shape of a crime story. A crime story wants a body, a villain, a verdict. What was done to the Osage money was slower and colder than that. It was a transfer, conducted in daylight, through courts and banks and offices, of a people's wealth into other hands, with murder used only where the paperwork alone would not move fast enough. Convicting Hale answered the murders. It never touched the transfer. The transfer had already succeeded. Look, finally, at what happened to the man at the center. William Hale was sentenced to life. He did not serve a life. In 1947, over the direct protests of the Osage, who understood exactly what he was, Hale was paroled. He walked out of prison a free man and lived years more, dying in 1962. By the accounts that survive, he was never sorry. He is remembered to have complained only that his nephew had talked, that if Ernest had kept quiet, they might have kept the money. That was the whole of his remorse. Not that the Osage had died, that the scheme had been spoiled. Ernest Burkhart, who had helped destroy his own wife's family, was also eventually paroled and later pardoned. John Ramsey, the paid killer, was paroled the same year as Hale. The punishments, such as they were, proved temporary for nearly everyone. There is one more silence to account for, and it is the largest of them all. For most of a century, almost no one outside the Osage remembered any of this at all. The murders were national news in the 1920s. Then they were gone. They did not enter the school books. They were not taught as part of the story of the oil age or the making of Oklahoma. Americans who could name the famous outlaws and lawmen of that exact time and place had never heard of the systematic murder of the richest people in the country. The Osage did not forget. They carried it in their families, in the empty chairs, in the children who grew up knowing which of their relatives had been killed and never answered for. But the wider country let it drop, as completely as the county had once let each inquest drop. That forgetting was not entirely an accident. A story like this one indicts too many people to sit comfortably in memory. It indicts a county, a court system, a guardianship program run by respectable men, a set of doctors and undertakers and lawyers, and a federal policy that had ruled a whole people incompetent and then watched them be robbed and killed. There is no single villain to hang it on and walk away. Hale was useful precisely because he could carry the blame for all of them, convict the king, close the famous case, and the larger machine, the one built of ordinary greedy men and bad law, could fade quietly out of the national memory. It did, and the men who were never caught lived out that forgetting in comfort. The guardians who had bled the estates, the merchants who had charged the Osage double, the beneficiaries who had married and inherited and moved on, mostly died respected. In the towns they had grown rich in, their names on churches and buildings rather than on indictments. The county did not cleanse itself. It simply stopped speaking of it and waited for the people who remembered to die. This is the answer to the question the video began under, the one the title asks: how many died, and why did so little of it reach a courtroom? The honest answer is that far more Osage were killed than the famous story admits, most likely many times more, and that almost none of those deaths were ever answered for, because the killing was not the work of one wicked man. It was a system, written into federal law, enforced by a county that profited, disguised as illness and accident and natural cause, and dismantled only at its most visible edge, only when it grew too loud to ignore, and only for the few crimes that happened to leave a document behind. The Bureau closed a case and called it justice. The record keeps a different account, and that account does not close. It was, in the end, not 24. Underneath that number is a larger one, and underneath that one is a silence, and the silence is the point. There is one name left to return to, the woman the whole plan was built to finish last, and who, against everything, was not. Mollie Burkhart was meant to be the last name in the plan. Everything the arithmetic had gathered in her. Her mother's share, her sister's shares, the inheritances pushed forward by every death. All of it had pooled, as designed, into the one surviving woman at the center. She was the vessel. And a vessel, once full, is meant to be emptied. So they had begun to empty her. Mollie had been sick for a long time, by the middle of the 1920s, weak and wasting in the same slow way her mother had before she died. She was being cared for as a diabetic, given regular treatment, regular injections, by doctors her family trusted. And she was getting worse, steadily, under that care. Because the care was the method. She was being poisoned in her own home, over months, by the people closest to her. Her husband was among them. She was lying down each night beside a man who was helping to kill her, and taking medicine from hands that were counting on her death. She did not know. That is the part that is hard to hold. She trusted Ernest. She trusted her doctors. The whole design depended on her trust, because trust was the delivery system. What saved her was time, and the outsiders. As the Bureau's investigation closed in on the county, the machine lost its freedom to operate. The killing had to stop while federal agents walked the ground. Mollie was gotten away from the treatment that was destroying her and put in the care of people with no stake in her death, and away from the poison. Slowly, she recovered. The vessel did not empty. She lived, which the plan had never allowed for. And as she regained her strength, she learned what the strength had cost and where the poison had come from. The investigation and the trials laid it out. The man she had married, the father of her children, had been part of the scheme that murdered her mother and her sisters, and had been complicit in the slow poisoning of Mollie herself. Ernest confessed. In 1926, Mollie divorced him. She had married into the family that had destroyed her own, and she ended that marriage with the full knowledge of what it had been. She did not disappear into the wreckage. In 1928, she married again, a man named John Cobb. She kept living, in the county where all of it had happened, among the graves of nearly everyone she had come from. And then there is the last turn, the one that pays back a word. This story planted at the very start. Mollie had spent her whole adult life ruled incompetent, declared, by a court, unfit to manage her own money, assigned a guardian to approve her spending, because she was a full-blood Osage. That designation had done more than humiliate her. It had been part of the machinery that nearly killed her, the legal frame that turned Osage wealth into a thing worth murdering for. In 1931, Mollie went to court and fought it, and won. She ended her guardianship. She was granted control of her own fortune, at last, in her 40s, after burying her entire family to the system that had called her incapable of holding a bank account. Read that turn plainly. The government had labeled her incompetent while she was healthy, wealthy, and capable. It gave her a guardian, while her family was murdered around her, for the money that guardian helped control. And only after she had survived poison, divorce, and the loss of nearly everyone she loved, did the same system finally agree that Mollie Burkhart could be trusted with what had always been hers. She did not receive competence as a gift. She had to sue for it. She had to take the word back herself. Mollie Burkhart died on the 16th of June, 1937. She was 50 years old. Her death, this time, was ordinary. Simply the end of a life that had carried more than any life should. The fortune the killers had died for did not go back to the people they took it from. The headrights of that era passed on down through heirs, as headrights do, and some of the shares that had been soaked in Osage blood ended up, over the generations, in the hands of people with no Osage in them at all. Congress had finally moved, in 1925, to stop non-Osage from inheriting these shares. Going forward, closing the open door a few years too late for the Kyle women. Much later, in 2011, the Osage Nation would win a settlement of hundreds of millions of dollars from the United States for the long mismanagement of their money. Neither of those facts brought anyone back. They only marked, in the record, that the thing had been real and wrong and finally, partly, admitted. Mollie is buried at Grey Horse, in the ground the Osage had been pushed to and then bought and then died on. The stone carries her name and the year she was born and the year she died. It does not say incompetent. By the time she was laid there, she had made the record take that word back. Around her lie the others, her mother, her sisters, the family that a closed list of names and a one-way door and a county's quiet permission had turned, one grave at a time, into the richest dead in America. The case that made the newspapers closed long ago. The count never did. It sits in the ground at Grey Horse and in the death records of a single Oklahoma county, in the exact shape the killers gave it, a number we cannot finish, under a word the government finally had to unsay.